The Galactic Council had reigned supreme for millennia, a vast bureaucracy woven from the threads of hundreds of ancient civilizations. They believed themselves the architects of order, the keepers of peace in a galaxy too chaotic to govern itself. When humanity first appeared on their registers, it was little more than a curiosity, a new species from a distant, overlooked world, desperate to join the galactic community. They were welcomed with the condescension afforded to all young races, shackled with treaties, protocols, and regulations designed to ensure their subservience. At first, humanity played the part expected of them. They signed the charters. They attended the council's endless sessions. They offered tribute, bowed to tradition, and asked permission before each new technological advancement. But something simmered beneath the surface, a restless energy the council failed to understand. Over mere decades, an eye blinked for the elder species, humans advanced with terrifying speed. Technologies that had taken others centuries to master were absorbed, reimagined, and surpassed in a fraction of the time. Worlds once deemed uninhabitable became thriving colonies. Economic influence spread like wildfire. In council halls, murmurs of concern began to ripple among the member species. Requests for inspections were refused. Attempts to impose trade restrictions were ignored. Human colonies expanded beyond designated sectors, brushing against the territories of elder races, with indifference bordering on disdain. The council issued warnings. They passed sanctions. They summoned ambassadors to chastise them. Each time, humanity responded with polite smiles, meaningless concessions, and continued on exactly as they wished. What the council did not realize or refuse to acknowledge was that humanity had already calculated the cost of compliance, and they had decided they would not pay it. At a critical meeting convened in desperation, the chambers of the Galactic Council buzzed with tension. Representatives of 100 species spoke over one another, some calling for swift action to humble the upstarts, others urging caution, recalling the humans' uncanny ability to turn adversity into strength. Old records were consulted, legends retold. Warnings from species long extinct echoed through dusty archives. Cautionary tales about beings from a blue world on the spiral's edge, who would not be ruled, would not be broken, and who would tear down any who tried. Yet arrogance is a powerful drug. Many counselors scoff at the idea that humans, so young and few, could threaten the foundations of galactic civilization. They pointed to the vast fleets under council command, the countless systems loyal to the order, the unbroken chain of centuries during which no rebellion had succeeded. Surely, they thought, the humans could be brought back into line, perhaps a show of force, a few seized trade lanes, strategic embargoes, the pressure of isolation. While the council debated and schemed, humanity moved quietly, methodically. They withdrew diplomats, pulled back corporate delegations, dismantled embassies on alien worlds with a speed that left stunned witnesses behind. Entire communication channels between Earth and the council sectors went silent. Border colonies closed themselves off, stationing defense platforms in low orbit with weapons arrays unknown to council intelligence. Patrol ships sent to monitor human space reported being shadowed by strange craft that blinked in and out of existence on scanners, faster than even the most sophisticated tracking systems could follow. The council chose to interpret these signs as bluffs, acts of desperation by a race that realized it had overreached. A few members spoke urgently of gathering a peace summit, but they were drowned out by louder voices calling for decisive action. Plans were drafted to isolate human sectors, to strangle their trade routes, to force them back into compliance through economic and military superiority. Then the message arrived. It came through a dozen channels simultaneously, encoded in every major diplomatic format recognized by the Council, ensuring no one could claim ignorance. From the office of the Terran Directorate, the message was chillingly short. Effective immediately, all diplomatic ties with the Galactic Council are severed. Any unauthorized approach to human space will be considered an act of war. No further negotiations will be entertained. There was no anger in the transmission, no grand declarations, no demands for concessions, just the cold finality of a door slamming shut. For a moment, the council chambers were silent. Representatives who had spent centuries weaving intricate webs of treaties and alliances stared at the transmission as if it were a death sentence. In a way, it was humanity had not petitioned. They had not pleaded. They had not even threatened. They had simply ended the conversation. Panic began to spread, thinly veiled beneath formal declarations and emergency motions. What followed would be a series of mistakes, born from arrogance and fear, as the council struggled to respond to an enemy that no longer played by the rules they had crafted, an enemy that no longer recognized their authority, an enemy that had just declared, without raising its voice, that it was done talking. As the councilors scrambled to assemble response, none could admit the truth forming silently in every mind present. They had just lost control of humanity. And deep down, they all understood they might have just lost control of the galaxy itself. The council chambers, once the symbol of galactic unity and calm, erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed through the vaulted halls as representatives scrambled to understand the implications of humanity's blunt severance. Protocols demanded order, but instinct overrode training. Fear cracked the practiced calm of ancient races, revealing the ugly truth beneath centuries of diplomacy. Panic had taken root, and it was growing fast. Within hours, emergency sessions were convened behind closed doors. Analysts, strategists, and historians were summoned, each tasked with explaining the inexplicable. How had the humans dared to defy the council? How had preparations for a conflict gone unnoticed? Theories abounded. Some claimed rogue human factions had seized power. Others suggested darker influences, perhaps ancient technologies or hidden benefactors. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Humanity had acted with full, deliberate unity. Council think tanks raced to model human behavior, but every prediction failed. Humans were not behaving like any species the Council had encountered. They were not making demands. They were not amassing on borders to bluff an invasion. They were not seeking back channels for negotiation. They had simply withdrawn, silent, focused, dangerous. Traditional models assumed that rebellion meant disorganization, chaos, desperation. Humanity showed none of these signs. Instead, they moved with clinical precision, cutting ties, burning bridges, locking doors behind them. Debate raged between two factions within the council. One side, dominated by elder races long and used to challenges, demanded immediate military action. They proposed sanctions, blockades, and surgical strikes to remind humanity of its place. The other side, smaller and growing increasingly desperate, urged caution. They pointed to humanity's unpredictability, to their history of transforming adversity into advantage. They spoke of Earth's history, brief but soaked in conflict, where every attempt at domination had only made humans stronger. Warnings were dismissed. The military faction prevailed. Orders were issued to assemble fleets near human borders. The plan was to intimidate, to force a capitulation without firing a shot. It was a strategy that had worked countless times against other upstart civilizations. It would not work this time. Leaked intelligence reports trickled into the chambers, each more disturbing than the last. Human colonies, far from panicking, had fortified with technology that defied council understanding. Deep space arrays were operational, planetary defense systems unmatched by any council world. Even more alarming were reports of mobile platforms, massive, self-sustaining cities capable of moving between systems under their own power. Attempt to hack human communications resulted in dead networks and silent counterinfiltration that shut down entire council spy programs overnight. Private conversations among council members took on a darker tone. Species that once postured about unity and law began quietly preparing defenses for their own homeworlds. Some quietly suspended diplomatic missions. Others moved fleets into defensive formations near core systems. Despite public declarations of strength, fear had fractured the council from within. Desperate to reassert control, a small task force was dispatched toward a human-controlled sector. Officially, it was a monitoring mission, meant to observe and report. Unofficially, it was a test, an act of pressure to see how far humanity would tolerate encroachment. They never arrived. No distress calls. No final transmissions. Just silence. Sensor station at the sector's edge registered only a brief gravitational disturbance before the fleet's signatures vanished completely. Analysis yielded no answers. It was as if the ships had been erased from existence. The loss of the task force sent shockwaves through the Council. For the first time, even the most arrogant species were forced to admit they no longer understood the nature of the enemy they faced. The humans had not postured. They had not issued ultimatums. They had not retaliated with overwhelming force. They had simply removed a threat with surgical precision, without fanfare or announcement. It was a statement louder than any declaration. Humanity did not need to explain themselves. Meetings stretched into endless cycles. Proposals flew across the chamber floors, some calling for immediate, full-scale war against humanity, others pleading for reconciliation. But it was too late for negotiation. The humans had made their position clear. Contact was severed. Any approach would be seen as hostile. The Council had waited too long, assuming their superiority would shield them from consequences. Now, they face an enemy who refused to play by the old rules. In the darker corners of the Council's records, scholars whispered about civilizations that had once challenged the status quo, of powers that rose from obscurity and swept aside the established order with terrifying speed. Each time, the Council had survived by adapting, by absorbing the new force into its structure before it could fully mature. But humanity was different. They had matured in isolation. They had studied the Council, learned from its mistakes, and when the time came, chose separation over assimilation. Economic impact began to ripple across Council space. Trade networks reliant on human technologies faltered. Whole sectors dependent on Terran innovations faced shortages and blackouts. Council industries, bloated and stagnant after centuries of complacency, could not match human ingenuity or output. Attempts to replicate human systems ended in costly failures, often sabotaged by hidden contingencies humanity had embedded long before the schism. The realization dawned slowly, painfully. Humanity had been preparing for this break for decades. Their compliance had been a mask, a study, a way to understand their future adversaries so completely that when the time came, victory would not require massed armies or open war. It would require simply stepping away, pulling the rug out from under an empire too arrogant to realize how much it depended on those it sought to control. Behind the Council's desperate measures lurked a deeper, unspoken fear. If humanity could sever itself so cleanly, so absolutely, what else were they capable of? What weapons had they developed in secret, beyond the Council's sight? What alliances had they formed in the dark corners of the galaxy, beyond the reach of diplomatic envoys? No answers came, only silence. And in that silence, dread grew. They had lost more than control. They had lost understanding. And now, in the void humanity left behind, only one certainty remained. The age of the Galactic Council was ending. The age of humanity was beginning. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The first real fractures inside the Galactic Council came not from external attacks, but from within their own ranks. Member worlds that had long enjoyed the wealth and stability provided by human ingenuity realized the new void could not be filled. Without Terran technology, without Terran markets, without Terran systems keeping entire sectors afloat, stagnation set in. Infrastructure projects failed. Starship production lines ground to a halt. Power grids and core systems flickered and failed. Suddenly, the mighty Council didn't look so mighty anymore. Arguments erupted. First behind closed doors, then on the public floor. Accusations flew. Some species accused others of hiding black market deals with humans, of profiting from technologies now cut off. Old rivalries reignited, and tentative alliances shattered under the weight of mutual distrust. Council sessions that once resolved disputes with calm negotiations devolved into bitter shouting matches. Small member species, once content to obey the elder races, began withdrawing into isolation, fortifying their borders and refusing Council oversight. The Council tried to project strength outwardly, ordering military parades, issuing declarations of stability. Internally, they knew it was a lie. Every declaration only deepened the cracks. The humans had not fired a single weapon openly, yet the Council was imploding. It was a collapse born of dependency, fear, and pride. Humanity hadn't needed to defeat the Council. They had only needed to make themselves absent. The first major defection came from the Ralthus Combine. Historically loyal, staunch supporters of Council doctrine, the Ralthists quietly closed their embassies and issued a terse statement. They would govern their own affairs without outside interference. At first, Council leadership laughed off the defection as insignificant. Within days, 2 neighboring systems followed suit, citing their reliance on human technologies to maintain autonomy. By the end of the cycle, 14 systems had declared varying degrees of independence. Panic gripped the Council's higher echelons. Emergency sessions were called. Urgent pleas were issued to wavering member states. Offers of increased aid, favorable trade deals, and security guarantees flooded across diplomatic channels. But it was too late. Words held no weight anymore. The member worlds had seen the Council exposed for what it was, a bloated, hollow institution that could neither protect nor provide without Terran support. Amid the political chaos, the Council's intelligence agencies scrambled for options. Their best minds were tasked with crafting a strategy, any strategy, to reassert dominance or at least regain some leverage over humanity. A secret plan, known only to the highest levels, was conceived. To infiltrate human space using clandestine operatives and retrieve whatever technologies or advantages they could find. The hope was that with enough stolen knowledge, the Council could reverse engineer a path back to superiority. The plan was audacious. It failed catastrophically. The first wave of operatives sent into human-controlled sectors vanished without a trace. No distress signals. No data recovered. Follow-up missions reported encountering automated defense systems of terrifying sophistication, drones capable of swarming entire fleets, weapons that distorted local space-time to obliterate targets without warning, artificial intelligences that anticipated infiltration attempts before they even began. The few agents who survived returned broken, mentally and physically shattered. Some spoke of hidden fortresses on isolated worlds, guarded by forces that made traditional Council fleets look obsolete. Others whispered of black projects, things humanity had hidden away during their time under Council observation. Technology so advanced, so alien, that they defied comprehension. The reports were dismissed publicly as fabrications born of fear, but in private, Council leadership listened. And they understood. Humanity had not just prepared to survive without the Council. They had prepared to dominate in its absence. As failures mounted, Council cohesion crumbled further. Debates over the next course of action turned violent. Delegates stormed out of sessions. Longtime allies severed ties. Member worlds began preparing for potential conflict, not against humanity, but against each other. With humanity's absence, the delicate balance of power that had kept ancient rivalries at bay disintegrated almost overnight. An emergency summit was called, gathering the most influential species in a last-ditch effort to salvage unity. For the first time, the Council's most secret archives were open to all delegates, revealing ancient warnings, records from civilizations that had long ago vanished, erased by forces unknown. Cross-referencing this information with recent intelligence, the Council came to a chilling conclusion. Humanity's rise was not an accident. It was a pattern, one seen before in forgotten ages, where a new force would rise on a galactic edge, refuse assimilation, and sweep away the old orders. The question was no longer how to bring humanity back into the fold. It was how to survive what was coming next. In a desperate move, factions within the Council began reaching out to humanity through third parties, intermediaries, anyone who might still have contact. They offered apologies. They offered concessions. They offered the unthinkable, partial autonomy, unrestricted technological development, even seats on the highest councils. Every overture was met with silence. No reply, no interest. Humanity had made its decision long before the Council realized the game had changed. As the Council flailed, reports of human movements beyond their borders began to surface. Mysterious colonies sprang up on unclaimed worlds. Massive convoys of starships moved through deep space, establishing networks beyond the Council's gaze. Alien species, long marginalized under Council rule, were seen collaborating openly with Terran envoys. Whispers of alliances formed in the dark spread fear through Council ranks. The greatest terror was not that humanity sought revenge. It was that humanity no longer cared enough to seek it. They were building something new, something vast and powerful, outside of the old systems. A new order was rising, and the Council was not invited. By the time the Council fully understood the depth of their mistake, it was already irreversible. They had spent centuries believing that diplomacy and control were eternal constants. They had failed to see that a single resolute act, the severing of ties, could be more devastating than any fleet, any battle, any weapon. In the end, it wasn't humanity's rage that broke the Council. It was humanity's indifference. And in that indifference, a new age was being born, one the Council would not survive to see. The collapse of the Galactic Council was not a singular event, but a slow, insidious unraveling, once proud and resolute. The Council had been founded on the belief that order could be imposed on a galaxy, that those who sought peace could attain it by simply adhering to the rules. But now, as member species scattered like embers from a dying fire, it became evident humanity had shattered that illusion. The Council had failed to foresee the consequences of crossing a species that would not bend. The war that many feared was never fought. Humanity had simply walked away, leaving an empire to crumble under its own weight. By the time the final session of the Galactic Council convened, it was clear to all that their decisions had been irrevocably altered by the absence of Terran influence. They tried one last time to salvage what little remained of their authority. Representatives from the last remaining loyalist worlds met, desperate for some way to stem the tide. But it was futile. The decisions had been made. The pieces had already fallen into place, beyond the reach of their control. Humanity, meanwhile, thrived. In the silence left by the Council collapse, Earth became a focal point, the Terran Directorate. Once just one voice in a chorus of galactic powers, now stood as the pivot around which the galaxy's future turned. From the ashes of diplomacy, a new order began to emerge. Not a council or an empire, but a network, open, decentralized, and driven by mutual cooperation, the foundation of which was humanity's own values of self-determination and innovation. The sudden rise of human influence did not go unnoticed. Former enemies, once eager to wipe them off the map, now came knocking, seeking alliances or, at the very least, acknowledgement. The shift was palpable. Where once humanity had been treated as a nuisance, now it was an undeniable force, one that no one could afford to ignore. Some species, still bitter from past interactions, chose to remain isolated, fearful of the changes that had been wrought by a race they had underestimated. But others, more pragmatic, embraced the future, recognizing that their survival in the new galaxy would depend on their ability to adapt to the Terran-led order. In the sectors closest to Earth, Terran fleets began to expand, not through conquest but through colonization and cooperation. Entire worlds were reshaped with human ingenuity, infrastructure rebuilt from the ground up, entire industries flourished. Alien species, once relegated to fringes, found their technologies integrated into a vast, thriving network. The human model of governance, one not based on authority or hierarchy, but on the empowerment of individuals and communities, began to take root. The Council's old structures, built on the assumption that they held the keys to galactic peace, were now seen as quaint relics of an obsolete past. Humanity's rise had shifted the balance, not just politically or economically, but culturally as well. Where the Council had once imposed its values on new members, humanity spread an ideology of independence and innovation. No longer were species expected to conform to a set of rigid standards. They were encouraged to think for themselves, to build new systems, to forge new paths. The result was a burgeoning age of creativity, a period of rapid technological and philosophical evolution. And in this new age, humanity found itself not just at the center of it, but as the very catalyst for change. The realization that the Council's influence was broken set in slowly, but with increasing urgency. Once the wealth and stability they had promised began to evaporate, entire star systems that had long relied on the Council's aid found themselves facing a stark choice: adapt to the new reality or face irrelevance. As the human-led model of decentralized, mutually beneficial cooperation gained ground, species began to leave the dying institutions behind, eager to be part of the new, brighter future. But not everyone was ready to embrace this new reality. There were still pockets of resistance. Fragments of the old guard held onto their titles, their fleets, their ideas of galactic order. They met in secret, hoping for a chance to regain some form of control. But their time had passed. Their hopes were futile. The day of centralized power was over. They had not just lost the council, they had lost the galaxy as it had once been. As Terran influence continued to grow, other powers began to realize that they had been complicit in their own downfall. In their arrogance, they had believed that humanity's methods, efficient, direct, and self-reliant, were simply temporary measures. They had thought that humanity's attempts to cooperate would lead them back into the fold of the old power structures. Instead, humanity had used the very tools of those systems to break free, and in doing so, had reshaped the very fabric of galactic society. The result was a paradox. The Galactic Council had once wielded its power with a sense of infallibility. It had believed that it could control the galaxy, that it could force civilizations into compliance. It had believed that it would never fall, and that the future would always bend to its will. But in the end, it was the very species it sought to control that had outsmarted it, using patience, innovation, and sheer will to break free. Humanity had not needed to destroy the Council. It had merely outgrown it. In its absence, humanity had not only survived, but had begun to shape the galaxy according to its own vision. What was left now were the pieces of an empire that had once held dominion over the stars. Those who had once been at the center of power now found themselves relegated to the periphery. The galaxy was no longer a council-run machine. It was a mosaic of new possibilities, of emerging systems, and of unprecedented cooperation. It was a world in which humanity no longer sought permission to exist, but took its place as a leader, as a force of nature, reshaping the very way the galaxy functioned. The Council's final failure was not simply in its inability to control humanity. It was in its blindness to the fundamental truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Those who are truly free can never be contained. Humanity had shown that, once and for all, they had built a new path for themselves, and in doing so, had shown the galaxy that the old ways of control were dead. The age of empire was over. The era of humanity had begun,